On April 3rd, 1968, Martin Luther King Jr. addressed a rally and delivered his famous "I've Been to the Mountaintop" speech at Mason Temple in Memphis, Tennessee. April 4th, the next day, he was fatally shot by James Earl Ray at the Lorraine Motel, and so the assassination of Dr. King led to a nationwide wave of riots and unrest. And so I wanted to look through these newspapers at the various responses in the days following Dr. King's death. The article, "National Political, Labor, and Religious Leaders Mourn Dr. King," written by Paul Hoffman for the New York Times on April 6, 1968, looks at the various responses from political, labor, and religious leaders. Some of the political leaders that Hoffman highlights are Secretary of State Dean Rusk, who said that we have to solve these racial issues quickly, but without these acts of violence. Presidential candidate at the time, Richard Nixon, canceled his campaign stops in Minnesota on this day, called Dr. King a great leader, said that we need to have a prayerful contemplation of the ghastly consequences of hatred. The only black senator at the time, Edward Brooke from Massachusetts, called it an unspeakable act. From a labor standpoint, the article quotes George Meany, the president of the American Federation of Labor and Congress of Industrial Organizations, and he notes that King was killed while striking with members of these organizations as he was in Memphis marching with the sanitation workers who were on strike. And from a religious perspective, leaders from the Protestant, Catholic, and Jewish faiths called for a day of prayer where they would all together pray that justice would roll down like waters and righteousness like an overflowing stream. Lynn Dash, in a Washington Post article entitled "Memphis Ministers Ask Calm, Gather at Temple," looks at the generational gap between the responses. Ministers were marching in the streets of Memphis trying to avert further violence, and they were pleading with angry youths to show restraint. Many young people, according to Dash, had gathered at Claiborne Temple, talking of taking revenge. One was quoted as saying, "It's going to burn tonight." And the article highlights some other unrest in Memphis during this time. He talks of how schools were closed, how there were reports of vandalism and fires, how there was also a new march scheduled by the sanitation workers, how the community then marched in solidarity with them. And finally, Anthony Lewis, in a New York Times article from April 1968 entitled "Europe Dismayed, Fearful for U.S., Murder of Dr. King Evokes Doubts Over Stability of the American Society," highlights the reactions across Europe. In Italy, Pope Paul VI said he was personally and deeply grieved. In France, state radio deleted an interview with a cabinet minister in order to run tributes to Dr. King. In Britain, members of all parties of the House of Commons introduced a motion expressing horror at the brutal and senseless murder of Martin Luther King. In the Soviet Union, the paper is quoted as saying, "The United States is a nation of violence and racism." A newspaper in Spain said Martin Luther King and John F. Kennedy were victims of the same assassin, which they said was hatred, non-understanding, and fanaticism. I think all three of these articles would enhance a classroom experience because they not only shed light on the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., but it gives students a deeper look at what the response was and what happened in the aftermath. It provides a local look from Ground Zero in Memphis to a national look and an international look at the responses across Europe, and also would give us a point of comparison to responses of civil rights unrest and tragedy back then to some of the things that have been going on in our present day society. But in the process, these articles provide a look at a key moment from a religious, social, political, generational, global, and even labor perspective.